Welcome back to the Explainer. Today, we're really going to teach this unit thoroughly, giving you a highly structured masterclass on the historical evolution of early language teaching methods. You know, if you've ever been sitting in a language class just completely scratching your head, wondering, why on earth are they teaching it to me this way? Well, understanding this history is absolutely crucial. I want you to think of this historical timeline like a giant pendulum, just constantly swinging back and forth. Every single new teaching method that pops up is essentially a direct reaction to the perceived failures and the massive frustrations of the era that came right before it. So in this explainer, we're going to trace exactly how teaching languages went from this incredibly strict, text-heavy mental exercise to the much more communicative, spoken approaches that we see evolving today. So here's our agenda for today's explainer. We're going to start with the reign of Latin, then we'll move into the grammar translation method, check out the reform movement, explore the direct method, and finally wrap things up with the method's era legacy. All right, let's jump right in.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the reign of Latin.
Okay, so to really get where modern language teaching comes from, we've got to rewind the clock about 500 years. Back in the 16th century, Latin wasn't just some dusty school subject. It was literally the dominant, living language of commerce, religion, and government across the Western world. It's how people got things done. But as we move into the 17th through 19th centuries, Latin's everyday status started to fade. It shifted from this crucial living language to more of an occasional academic subject. By the 18th century, modern languages, French, English, started actually entering the school curriculum. But here's the catch. Because Latin had been so historically revered, the intense, rigorous way it was taught, which was entirely through rote learning of grammar and translation, well, that became the absolute gold standard for teaching everything. Studying a language suddenly wasn't about communicating at all anymore. It was basically viewed as this rigorous mental gymnastic meant to just toughen up your intellectual abilities.
You want to know what those early mental gymnastics actually looked like in practice? Well, get a load of these real translation exercises pulled straight from a 19th century textbook. The philosopher pulled the lower jaw of the hen. Or how about, the cat of my aunt is more treacherous than the dog of your uncle. I mean, seriously, imagine being a student and being forced to translate these entirely disconnected, completely bizarre sentences. This totally deadening experience of just rote learning abstract grammar rules and translating practically useless vocabulary. It shows exactly why language teaching desperately, absolutely needed a major reform. Actually speaking the foreign language simply wasn't even on the radar.
And that brings us formally to Section 2, the grammar translation method. So this highly robotic, text-heavy approach to learning modern languages officially became known as the grammar translation method, though back in the US it was originally dubbed the Prussian Method. Let's really break down its core principles. The end goal? Strictly reading literature and building that mental discipline we talked about. The focus was 100% on reading and writing, no speaking. The primary tools for students were basically just staring at bilingual word lists and doing intense dictionary study. Structurally, the single sentence was the basic unit of everything. Your absolute top priority as a student was meticulous, flawless accuracy. And the overarching strategy they used is what we call deductive grammar. That means the rules were explicitly taught to you first, and only then did you actually practice translating. Notice the glaring omission here? The student's native language was the absolute medium of instruction, and actual oral practice or listening comprehension was basically completely non-existent. Now here's the really wild part. Despite causing a truly tedious and incredibly frustrating experience for millions of learners over the decades, the grammar translation method remarkably still persists in some parts of the world today. I mean, why on earth would that be? Well, if you look at it from an administrative side, it makes perfect sense. It requires very limited resources, it perfectly suits extremely large classes, it gives teachers complete authority and control in the classroom, and, crucially, it demands very little actual speaking proficiency from the instructor themselves. It's just incredibly easy to manage, even if it has virtually no real basis in modern linguistic theory. But of course, pushback was inevitable. Let's move on to Section 3, the reform movement. So, by the mid-19th century, the world is changing. Increased travel and communication across Europe meant people actually needed speaking proficiency. They needed to converse, not just sit around reading old texts, and this sparked a massive push for educational reform. One of the absolute coolest early innovations came from a Frenchman named François Gouin. He developed these situational action sequences that went something like this. I walk toward the door. I draw near to the door. I get to the door. I stop at the door. I stretch out my arm, I take hold of the handle. Instead of throwing abstract grammar rules at you, Gouin used these logically connected sequences of physical actions to make the meaning instantly clear right through the context. It was a huge, massive leap forward toward actual practical usage.
And this practical momentum really built up toward the end of the century. Cut to 1886, and we hit a major milestone. The International Phonetic Association, or the IPA, is officially founded. This was a massive turning point because practical-minded linguists officially stood up and recognized that the primary form of language is, in fact, speech, not the written word. They advocated incredibly strongly for the study of spoken language, for actual phonetic training to establish good pronunciation, and for an inductive approach to grammar, where you actually figure out the rules from the context itself. These linguists laid the vital, scientific groundwork for the next massive swing of our historical pendulum.
Which swings us right into Section 4, the direct method. Talk about a reaction. The direct method was the ultimate polar opposite reaction against grammar translation. The core philosophy here was to try and mirror the natural, intuitive way that little kids learn their very first language. And listen to how strict these tenets were. Instruction was conducted exclusively in the target language. Absolutely no native language allowed. They taught only everyday conversational vocabulary. The whole classroom environment was built around these continuous, rapid-fire question-and-answer oral exchanges between the teacher and the student. Grammar was taught purely inductively. Vocabulary was taught not by translating a word list, but by literally pointing to objects and pictures in the room. And correct pronunciation was heavily emphasized right from day one. You might actually recognize some of these principles from the famous Berlitz schools, which operated on the famously strict guideline, never translate, demonstrate.
Let's just pause for a second to directly contrast these two distinct eras, just to mentally cement this whole pendulum swing concept we've been talking about. Think of grammar translation as deductive grammar, conducted entirely in the student's native language with this super heavy reading and writing focus. The direct method is its total, absolute inversion. Inductive grammar, target language exclusively, and a massive focus on speaking and listening. The direct method literally shifted the entire goal of language learning from literary analysis to active spoken communication. But like all extremes, the direct method eventually faced some pretty severe criticisms. While it was super successful in highly motivated, small private schools, it was incredibly difficult to roll out in massive public education systems. For one, it required native or native-like fluency from everyday teachers, which, let's be real, just wasn't practical. It also lacked a rigorous applied linguistic theory truly backing it up. And honestly, the dogmatic, incredibly strict avoidance of the student's native language was sometimes just wildly inefficient. The Harvard psychologist Roger Brown famously described his absolute frustration observing teachers performing these absurd verbal gymnastics just to convey the meaning of a simple word when a quick 1-second translation into the native language would have led to immediate, perfect comprehension. So where does that leave us? Let's hit our final section, Section 5, the Methods Era Legacy. As we moved fully into the 20th century, the initial successes and then the eventual decline of the direct method basically ushered in what we now call the methods era in language teaching. Because we really want to teach the unit thoroughly today, let's lock down a formal definition of exactly what a method actually is. In applied linguistics, a method is defined as a theoretically consistent set of teaching procedures that define good practice in language teaching. The huge controversy over the direct method, that was really just the first of many debates. This obsessive quest to find the absolute best method, perfectly packaged with a neat set of procedures, well, that would go on to completely dominate the attention of teachers and applied linguists throughout the entire 20th century. To wrap up our explainer today, I really want to leave you with a question to help you actively apply this historical framework to your own life. Think back on your own educational memories. Have you ever experienced grammar translation instruction yourself? Or maybe you were taught using strict elements of the direct method. How was your experience? Did you find yourself translating completely bizarre sentences about your aunt's cat? Or were you forced to speak only in the target language right from day one? Understanding this historical pendulum swing helps us so deeply understand the mechanics of our own learning journeys. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep learning.